He publicly divorced his wife on the stage of North America's largest Mafia convention, standing next to his pregnant mistress in front of hundreds of the continent's most notorious crime bosses. He expected applause, but what he received was a deadly silence. Then one by one, the godfathers rose and quietly left the room, abandoning him right on his own stage. Who was this humiliated wife that the entire underworld had to bow down to? Follow the story to the end, and don't forget to like and comment with the city you're watching from, so I know how far this story has progressed. The casino sat on the edge of the Atlantic like something that had clawed its way out of the water and decided to stay. Black Crest. 40 floors of armored glass, private elevators that didn't show up on any blueprint, and a ballroom on the top level where men who controlled half the continent's illegal money came once a year to remind each other they were still alive. Alessandra Vale stood in front of a mirror in a service hallway 3 floors below that ballroom, fixing an earring that didn't need fixing. Her hands were steady. That was the part that scared her. 15 years she'd spent learning how to keep her hands steady when everything else was on fire. She'd learned it the hard way, the way you learn anything that matters, by getting it wrong first, by watching men die because she hadn't learned it yet. Now it was just muscle memory. Breathe in for 4. Hold. Let it out slow enough that nobody in the room could see your ribs move. She heard her own pulse in her ears and ignored it. "You don't have to go up there," said Marisol, her assistant, standing by the door with a tablet pressed to her chest like a shield. Marisol was 26 and had the kind of nervous energy that made her chew the inside of her cheek when she lied to herself about being calm. "Yes, I do," Alessandra said. "He's not going to do anything tonight. He needs the summit. He needs the families behind him for the tri-state deal." "I know what he needs." Alessandra turned from the mirror. Her dress was simple, black, no jewelry beyond the earrings, and she'd chosen it that way on purpose. Every other woman walking into that ballroom tonight would be dressed like a chandelier. She wanted to be dressed like a knife. "That's the problem, Mari. I know exactly what Cassian needs, and so does he. And somehow he still thinks he can do this without telling me what it costs him to need it." Marisol didn't have an answer for that. Nobody ever did. 3 floors up, Cassian Moretti was getting his jacket adjusted by a man who'd been adjusting Moretti jackets since Cassian's father ran the family, and Cassian wasn't looking at the mirror. He was looking past it, at the door, like he expected someone to walk through and stop him. Nobody walked through. "You sure about this?" the tailor said. It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of thing old men said to young men right before the young men did something the old men already knew was a mistake. "I'm sure," Cassian said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. He wasn't sure. He hadn't been sure in months, but uncertainty wasn't a thing you could afford to carry into a room full of men who fed on it, so he'd buried it the way he buried everything. Under noise, under motion, under the particular arrogance that had kept the Moretti name on top of the food chain for 3 generations. His mistress was in the next room. Vivian Hale, 28, 6 months pregnant, beautiful in the kind of obvious way that made men stupid, sitting very still while a stylist pinned the back of a dress that had been let out twice already to accommodate her stomach. She caught Cassian's eye in the doorway, and something passed between them that wasn't quite love and wasn't quite fear, but lived somewhere in the cramped space between the two. "They're going to hate me," Vivian said quietly once the stylist had stepped out. "They're going to respect what I'm building," Cassian said. "This child, this family, a future that isn't—" He stopped himself. "Isn't what?" "Isn't her?" He didn't answer. Vivian pressed a hand to the curve of her stomach, an old habit, like checking that something fragile hadn't slipped while she wasn't watching. "You haven't told me what happens to her, Alessandra, after tonight." "She'll be taken care of." "That's not an answer, Cassian." "It's the only one I have." Downstairs, the ballroom was filling. Crystal chandeliers threw light over round tables set with linen so white it looked unreal, and the air smelled like champagne and money and the particular cologne that powerful men seemed to agree on without ever discussing it. Waiters moved between tables with the practiced invisibility of people who'd learned not to listen, even when they couldn't help but hear everything. At the head table sat the men who mattered. Don Reyes from the Western Corridor, his face like something carved out of granite 40 years ago and never softened since. Don Kovic, who ran the docks from Halifax to Baltimore and hadn't smiled in public since his wife died. Old Salvatore Greco, 81 years old, who'd known Cassian's father and grandfather both, and who watched the room now with the patient, unblinking attention of a man who had outlived every enemy he'd ever made by simply waiting. And empty, at the center of it all, the seat that belonged to Alessandra Vale. "She's late," murmured Kovic. "She's never late," Greco said. He didn't look up from his wine, which means something's wrong or something's about to happen. With that woman, it's usually both. The lights shifted. A hush moved through the room the way wind moves through wheat, and every head turned toward the stage, where Cassian Moretti stood in a dark suit with a microphone in his hand and an expression he'd practiced in 3 different mirrors that afternoon and still hadn't gotten right. Beside him, Vivienne, glowing, pregnant, terrified, smiling like someone had told her exactly how to smile, and she was following the instructions to the letter. "Friends," Cassian said, and his voice carried out over the silverware and the low murmur of 200 conversations dying at once. "Family. Tonight isn't just about alliances. Tonight is about the future." Somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a side door opened without a sound, and Alessandra Vale walked in. Nobody noticed yet. That was the thing about her. She'd spent 15 years learning how to enter a room without announcing herself, how to be the last thing anyone saw and the first thing they remembered. She moved along the wall, found a position near Greco's table, and stood with her hands folded in front of her like she was watching a performance she already knew the ending to. "For 3 generations," Cassian continued, "the Moretti name has stood for strength, for control, for the kind of leadership that doesn't bend." He reached for Vivienne's hand. "Tonight, I want to introduce you to the woman who is going to carry that strength into the next generation, Vivienne Hale, the mother of my child, the future of this family." The silence in the room changed texture. It went from polite to something colder. "As of this evening," Cassian said, and here his voice cracked slightly, just slightly, like a man stepping onto ice he wasn't entirely sure would hold. "My marriage to Alessandra Vale is over. I'm formally ending that chapter. Vivienne will stand beside me as we move this family forward." He lifted his glass. He waited for the room to lift theirs. Nobody moved. Don Reyes sat with his glass untouched on the table in front of him, his jaw working slowly like he was chewing on something bitter. Kovic's eyes had gone flat and unreadable. Old Greco hadn't even looked up. He was studying his wine like it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the room. Cassian's smile started to slip. "To the future," he said again, louder, like volume could fix what silence had already broken. And then Greco stood up. He didn't say anything. He simply rose from his chair, buttoned his jacket with the slow deliberation of a man twice Cassian's age and immeasurably more patient, and walked toward the exit. Behind him, Reyes stood too. Then Kovic. Then, like dominoes falling in a pattern that had clearly been agreed upon without a single word being exchanged in that room, every head of every family present rose from their seat and began walking toward the doors. Nobody shouted. Nobody threw a glass or flipped a table the way it happened in the stories men told each other about nights like this one. It was worse than that. It was quiet. It was final. 200 of the most dangerous people on the eastern seaboard turned their backs on Cassian Moretti in complete, suffocating silence and walked out of his summit like it had never happened at all. Cassian stood on the stage with the microphone still in his hand, his arm still raised with the champagne glass, his mouth slightly open like he was waiting for the room to explain the joke to him. Vivienne's hand had gone cold in his. "Cassian," she whispered. "Cassian, what's happening?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was watching the doors empty out, watching decades of his family's power walk out of a room without so much as a sneer in his direction. And somewhere underneath the rage building in his chest was something colder and much harder to name. The first real taste of fear he'd had in years. Then he saw her. Alessandra hadn't moved. She stood near the back wall in her plain black dress, watching him with an expression that wasn't anger and wasn't triumph. It was something closer to grief, the look of someone watching a building they'd spent their whole life maintaining finally collapse from the inside. Their eyes met across the wreckage of the ballroom. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She simply turned, in the same unhurried way Greco had, and followed the last of the dons out into the night. Outside, beneath the white stone awning of the Black Crest entrance, the valets had stopped running. Nobody was calling for cars. The motorcades, black, armored, identical down to the tinted windows, sat in 2 long rows along the circular drive, engines idling, drivers standing at attention beside open doors. And one by one, as Alessandra Vale stepped out into the cold ocean air, the dons turned toward her. Reyes inclined his head first, a small motion, but unmistakable. The kind of gesture men like him didn't waste on people who hadn't earned it through blood or fear, usually both. Kovic followed. Then 3 more family heads whose names didn't appear in any newspaper, but who controlled more square mileage of illegal commerce than most small countries. Greco was last. He took her hand in both of his, old skin against the cool composure of hers, and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. She answered him just as quietly. Whatever she said made the old man's mouth tighten into something that might have been the closest thing to a smile Salvatore Greco had worn in a decade. Marisol watched it all from the steps, her tablet forgotten against her chest, her mouth slightly open. She'd worked for Alessandra for 3 years. She'd seen her negotiate, seen her absorb insults from men twice her size without flinching, seen her sit across from killers and walk out with treaties signed in her favor. She had never seen this. She had never seen the actual shape of what her boss had built, because Alessandra had never let anyone see it all at once. Now it stood in front of her in the cold, salt air, every dawn on the eastern seaboard, bowing their heads to a woman who, 20 minutes ago, had just been publicly discarded by her husband in front of all of them. "They're not bowing to the Moretti name," Marisol said, almost to herself. "No," Alessandra said, watching the cars begin to pull away one by one, taillights disappearing down the coastal road. They never were. Back inside the ballroom, Cassian had finally lowered the glass. The room was nearly empty now, just caterers beginning, hesitantly, to clear plates that had never been touched, and the skeleton of his own security detail standing near the walls with the particular stillness of men who didn't know whether they still had a job. Vivian was crying, quietly, one hand pressed against her stomach like she could somehow shield the child inside her from whatever had just happened in this room. "Get her out of here," Cassian said to no one. To everyone, his voice flat and strange in his own ears. "Get the car." He stood alone on the stage for another moment, the microphone still warm in his hand, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific, bottomless silence of a room that had decided, collectively, that he didn't matter anymore. He set the microphone down. His phone began buzzing in his jacket pocket before he'd even made it off the stage. He pulled it out, expecting his head of security, expecting damage control, expecting someone to tell him this was fixable. It was his lawyer. 3 investors just pulled out of the tri-state financing. Effective immediately, no explanation given. A second message arrived before he'd finished reading the first. Couldn't reach Benedetti. His assistant says he's reconsidering his position on the renewal. A third? Cassian, call me. This is bad. He stood very still in the middle of the empty stage, phone in hand, the chandeliers still blazing overhead like nothing at all had happened, and felt the floor of his entire life tilt slightly beneath him. Not collapsing yet, not all at once, but shifting, the way a building shifts right before the cracks start showing in the walls. In the parking structure beneath the casino, his head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Tomas, who'd worked for the family since Cassian was a teenager, was having a very different conversation. He stood near the loading dock with his back to the cameras, phone pressed to his ear, voice low. "It's done," Tomas said. "Tonight, like we planned." He just torched his own credibility in front of every family on the coast. A pause, listening. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Vivian thinks this was all his idea. Another pause, longer this time, and something in Tomas's jaw tightened. The kid's not the point. The kid was never the point. The point is, what happens to the empire once Cassian's finished burning it down himself? We just have to make sure we're the ones holding the pieces when he does. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket, glancing once toward the elevator that led up to the ballroom, where somewhere above him, Cassian Moretti was still trying to understand what he'd just lost. Tomas allowed himself something close to a smile. Upstairs, in a private car pulling away from the Black Crest Drive, Vivian sat with her hands folded over her stomach, staring out the window at the dark water sliding past, replaying the silence of that room over and over, the way you replay the moment right before an accident, searching for the instant you could have stopped it. "They hate me," she said quietly. "They don't even know you," Cassian said, sitting beside her, his eyes fixed on his phone, on the messages still coming in, each one worse than the last. "This isn't about you." "Then who is it about?" He didn't answer. He was thinking about his wife. Ex-wife, he corrected himself, though the word still felt foreign in his mouth. Standing in that ballroom with an expression he couldn't read, watching his entire world come apart without lifting a finger to either help him or stop it. He'd spent 15 years believing he ruled the East Coast through fear, through the reputation his father had built and he'd inherited and sharpened, through the simple, brutal calculus that men who were afraid of you did what you told them. Standing on that stage, watching 200 of the most powerful criminals in North America turn their backs on him in absolute silence, he understood, too late, the way men like him always understood things too late, that he hadn't been the one holding any of it together. She had. And he had no idea, not yet, just how much of his world was about to come apart because of it. The car merged onto the coastal highway, taillights from the departing motorcades long gone into the dark. And somewhere behind them, back at the Black Crest Casino, Alessandra Vale stood alone on the empty drive in the cold Atlantic wind, watching the last car disappear, already turning over in her mind the calls she would need to make before dawn. And the clause buried in 15 years of carefully negotiated peace treaties that Cassian had just triggered without even realizing it existed. Dawn came up gray and mean over the Atlantic, the kind of light that didn't so much rise as seep through the clouds like something leaking from a wound. Cassian hadn't slept. He sat in the study of the Moretti compound with 3 phones lined up on the desk in front of him, all of them dark now, all of them having delivered their bad news hours ago, and he stared at the wall like it owed him an explanation. The door opened without a knock. Tomas never knocked. That was supposed to be a sign of trust, the kind of access only a few men in this organization had ever earned, and this morning it just felt like another thing Cassian no longer had control over. "Talk to me," Cassian said, not looking up. "Benedetti's out. Officially this time, not just reconsidering. He's pulling his whole position from the tri-state deal, and he's telling people why." Thomas crossed the room and stood with his arms folded, the posture of a man delivering a verdict he'd already accepted. "Word spreading that you broke the code, publicly, in front of witnesses who matter. It's my marriage, Tomas, not a treaty. With respect, boss, it stopped being just your marriage about 15 years ago." Tomas's voice had an edge to it that Cassian hadn't heard before, or maybe he had, and hadn't been listening. "Alessandra brokered half the piece this family runs on. You think Reyes signed on to the Western Corridor deal because he liked your father? He signed because she sat in a room with him for 6 hours and worked out water rights nobody else could touch." Cassian's jaw tightened. "I built this family's power. You inherited it. She maintained it." Tomas said it flat, no apology in it, and the silence after hung in the room like smoke that wouldn't clear. "I'm not telling you what you want to hear. I'm telling you what's happening whether you want to hear it or not." Cassian stood so fast the chair scraped backward and nearly toppled. "Careful." "I've been careful for 20 years, Tomas said, not backing down, not even blinking. "Careful's not going to fix what happened last night." For a moment neither man moved. The room held its breath. Then Cassian exhaled, dragged a hand down his face, and the fight went out of him the way air leaves a punctured tire. Not all at once, just a slow, humiliating deflation. "What do I do?" he said, and it wasn't really a question, more like a confession. Tomas studied him for a long beat. Something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, maybe, or something closer to contempt dressed up as patience. "You go to her," he said finally. "Today, before this gets any worse." "Go to who?" "Alessandra. You think this stops because you signed papers? The families didn't leave because of a divorce, Cassian. They left because they don't trust you to keep your word, and she's the only proof left that this family ever kept it. Across the city, in a sleek glass office building that bore no Moretti name on its directory, Alessandra Vale hadn't slept either, though it didn't show. She sat behind a wide desk with 3 laptops open and a landline pressed to her ear, her voice low and even, the same tone she'd used for 15 years to talk armed men down from decisions they'd regret. "I understand your concerns, Salvatore," she said. "I do. But the Continental Accord doesn't dissolve because one man embarrassed himself on a stage. It survives because the people who built it understand the difference between him and what we created together." She listened. Across the desk, Marisol sat with a legal pad covered in shorthand, watching her boss with the particular awe of someone witnessing a controlled demolition, a building coming down exactly where it was supposed to, no collateral damage, every charge placed with surgical precision. "No," Alessandra said into the phone. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to remember that the agreements bear my signature, not just his." A pause. "Thank you, Salvatore. I'll see you Thursday." She hung up and sat very still for a moment, both hands flat on the desk, breathing. "That's 4, Marisol said quietly. 4 families confirmed they're staying in the accord regardless of what happens with Cassian." "It's not enough." Alessandra's voice had gone thin, stretched tight over something underneath it that Marisol had rarely heard. Not fear exactly, but its closest cousin. "Kovic hasn't called back. Reyes is reviewing his position, which means he's deciding whether loyalty to me is worth the headache of dealing with whatever Cassian does next." "You don't owe Cassian anything anymore. This was never about Cassian." Alessandra stood, walked to the window, looked out over a skyline she'd spent a decade and a half quietly stitching peace into, one impossible negotiation at a time. "It's about every family who trusted that the Moretti name meant something. If that trust collapses because of what he did last night, it's not just his collapse. It's everyone's." Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen and her whole body went rigid. "Cassian." Marisol saw her face change. "Don't answer that." "I have to." "You don't have to do anything for him ever again." Alessandra picked up the phone anyway, because Marisol was wrong, and they both knew it. This had never been about what Alessandra owed Cassian. It was about control, about information, about keeping her hand on the wheel of something that was currently sliding toward a cliff with his name on it. "What?" she said into the phone. No greeting, no softness. "I need to see you." Cassian's voice sounded different, rougher, like something had been sanded off it overnight. "You had your chance to talk to me. You used it to humiliate me in front of 200 people instead." "Alessandra, don't." The word came out like a blade. "Don't say my name like that, like we're still something to each other. You ended that on a stage with a microphone in your hand and a pregnant woman on your arm. You don't get to call me the next morning and pretend that didn't happen." There was a silence on the line, long enough that she almost hung up. "The families are pulling out," Cassian said finally. "Everything's falling apart. You need me to fix what you broke." She laughed, short and humorless. "That's not new, Cassian. That's the entire shape of our marriage. That's not fair." "Fair?" Her voice cracked on the word. The first real fracture in 15 years of careful composure, and she hated herself for it instantly. "You want to talk to me about fair? I built every wall holding this family up while you stood on top of it taking credit for the view. And the second you wanted something prettier, you tore down the wall with me still standing in it." "I'll fix it." "You can't fix it. That's the part you still don't understand." She was pacing now, Marisol watching with wide eyes from across the room. "The families didn't walk out because of Vivian. They walked out because you proved, in front of every person who matters, that your word means nothing the second it's inconvenient. That's not something flowers and an apology repairs." "So what, you're just going to let it all burn? 15 years, Alessandra. 15 years I spent making sure men like you got to keep playing king while women like me did the actual work of holding the kingdom together." Her voice dropped, quiet and lethal. "I'm done. Figure out your own mess." She hung up before he could answer, and stood there with the phone still in her hand, breathing hard, Her reflection ghosted faintly in the window glass. And for just a second, just one unguarded second, Marisol saw something cross her boss's face that looked less like triumph and more like grief trying to disguise itself as anger. Then it was gone, replaced by the same controlled stillness Alessandra wore like armor, and she set the phone down and said, "Get me Kovic, in person if he won't take the call." Across town, Vivian sat alone in the nursery that had been prepared in the east wing of the Moretti estate. Pale yellow walls, a crib that had cost more than most people's cars, and not a single piece of it feeling real anymore. She heard footsteps in the hallway, and her whole body tensed before the door even opened. It wasn't Cassian. It was Tomas. "He's not back yet?" she asked. "He's dealing with the families. It's a mess out there." Tomas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Too patient, too careful, like a man choosing his words the way you'd choose footing on ice. "How are you holding up?" "Like I just watched 200 people decide I'm the reason everything's falling apart." She pressed a hand against her stomach. "Was I wrong, Tomas? Did I do something?" "You didn't do anything." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, his voice dropping into something gentler, something that felt, in the moment, like the only kindness she'd been offered in 12 hours. "None of this is your fault. You know that, right? Then whose fault is it?" Tomas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had a careful weight to it, like he was setting something heavy down very slowly so it wouldn't make a sound. "I probably shouldn't say this. Say it. There are people in this family, captains, men close to Cassian, who've been planning for this moment for a long time, waiting for a crack to widen." He watched her face carefully. "I'm not saying Cassian did this on purpose. I'm saying he's been surrounded by people pushing him toward exactly this outcome, and I don't think he even realizes how deep it goes." Vivian's hand tightened against the curve of her stomach. "What does that mean for me? For the baby?" "It means you need to be careful who you trust right now." Tomas reached out briefly and touched her hand. A small gesture, deniable, the kind of thing that could mean nothing or everything depending on how it landed. "I'm one of the only people in this house who actually wants to protect you both. I need you to remember that, whatever happens next." She nodded, slowly, not fully understanding what he was telling her, only understanding that fear had found a new shape to live in. By mid-afternoon, Cassian was standing in the marble lobby of a building owned by Don Kovic, having been kept waiting 40 minutes by a man who would have once dropped any meeting to take his call. When Kovic finally appeared flanked by 2 of his own men, he didn't offer a handshake. "You drove all the way out here," Kovic said. "Must be important." "You know why I'm here." "I have a guess." Kovic's face was unreadable, carved from the same patient granite as Rhea's, men who'd learned a long time ago that showing nothing was its own kind of weapon. "You want me to tell you the tri-state deal still stands, that last night doesn't change anything." "It doesn't have to change anything. The terms are the same." "The terms were never the problem, Cassian." Kovic's voice was low, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "The problem is that I do business with men whose word holds weight. Your father's word held weight. Your wife's word holds weight. Held, I should say. Yours, as of last night, is worth exactly as much as I can verify with someone else's signature." "That's insulting." "It's accurate." Kovic stepped closer, close enough that Cassian could see the exhaustion in the older man's face, the particular weariness of a man who'd hoped for better and gotten confirmation of his worst suspicions instead. "You stood on a stage and broke a 15-year marriage to a woman who kept this entire coast from going to war, and you did it like you were announcing a business merger. You didn't even have the decency to do it privately first. My personal life isn't your business. Your personal life became my business the moment you used a peace summit to stage it." Kovic's jaw worked, anger finally cracking through the granite. "I have grandchildren, Cassian. I got into the accord because Alessandra promised me a world where they don't grow up watching wars over territory like I did. You think I'm going to risk that on a man who can't keep a vow in front of his own family, let alone mine?" Cassian said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth of it sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow or spit out. "Fix your house," Kovic said, turning to leave. "Then come talk to me about deals." That evening, in the windowless back room of a club that didn't appear on any map worth trusting, Tomas sat across from two men Cassian had never fully trusted. Dario Esposito, who ran the family's financial operations, and a man known only as Reyes's nephew Marco, who'd inherited none of his uncle's patience and twice the ambition. A bottle of something dark sat between them, untouched. "It's happening faster than we planned," Dario said. "Investors are spooking. If the tri-state deal collapses entirely, we lose the financial base we need before we can move." "It's happening exactly the way I wanted it to," Tomas said. "Cassian's spending all his energy trying to win back people who already decided he's finished. He's not looking at what's happening inside his own house." "And the girl, Vivian?" "Soft, scared, easy." Tomas turned his glass slowly on the table, watching the liquid catch the dim light. "She trusts me. By the time the kid's born, she'll trust me with everything, including whatever leverage we need over Cassian once he realizes what's actually happening to him." Marco leaned forward. "And Alessandra?" Something changed in Tomas's face, a flicker, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "Alessandra is the only real problem left. She's smarter than Cassian, she's more trusted than Cassian, and she's still got 15 years of relationships we can't buy or threaten our way past." He took a slow breath. "Which is why we need her gone from this entirely. Not killed, removed, discredited, isolated, or convinced to walk away on her own. If she stays in this fight, we don't win it." "How do you discredit a woman everyone respects?" "Everyone has a weak point," Tomas said. "Even her." 3 days passed in a kind of slow-motion collapse, the sort of thing that didn't look catastrophic from any single angle, but added up, hour by hour, into something that could no longer be stopped. 2 more families formally withdrew from active partnership with the Moretti Syndicate. A shipment meant to cross through Kovic's territory was quietly rerouted without explanation, costing Cassian nearly $400,000, and more importantly, telling every other family watching that Kovic no longer considered Moretti routes safe to guarantee. Cassian started drinking earlier in the day. He stopped sleeping in the same wing as Vivienne, not out of cruelty, but because every time he looked at her growing stomach, he saw the stage, the silence, the weight of every decision that had led him here, and he couldn't carry that and tenderness at the same time. Alessandra worked 18-hour days holding together what was left of the accord with a combination of personal favors, old debts called in, and sheer force of will. She stopped eating regular meals. Marisol started leaving food on her desk that went cold, untouched, while Alessandra paced the office on calls that grew shorter and more brittle with each passing day. On the 4th night, Cassian showed up at her building unannounced, past midnight, having had enough whiskey to feel brave and not enough to lose his footing on the way up in the elevator. Marisol had gone home hours ago. Alessandra was alone in the office when the door opened, and she looked up to find her ex-husband standing in the doorway, tie loosened, eyes red-rimmed, looking like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for days and had finally set it down somewhere it didn't belong. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know." "Then leave." "I can't." He stepped further into the room, and she noticed he was unsteady, not drunk exactly, but close enough that the careful walls he usually kept up had started leaning. "I lost Kovic today. Officially. He's pulling out of everything. Esposito's family is wavering. I've got captains in my own organization who won't return my calls. That's not my problem anymore. It's everyone's problem." His voice rose, frustration cracking through. "You think you're protected just because you're not married to me? You think the chaos stops at some legal line we drew? If the syndicate collapses, Alessandra, it takes the accord with it. Every family you've spent 15 years stitching together, gone. Because I made one mistake." "One mistake?" Her laugh came out sharp, disbelieving. "You stood on a stage in front of every family on the coast and told the world your marriage meant nothing. You did it with your mistress on your arm and her child in her stomach." "That's not a mistake, Cassian. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. What you did was an execution, and you used my reputation as the rope." "I didn't think it would—" "You didn't think. That's exactly the problem. You never think past the moment you're standing in." She stood, came around the desk, stopping close enough that he could see the exhaustion carved into her face. The same exhaustion he'd put there. "Do you know what I've been doing for 3 days? calling in every favor I have left. Sitting across from men who buried their own brothers in territory wars I helped them avoid, asking them to trust a family that just proved it doesn't keep promises. I have spent 15 years building something so that men like you never had to learn what real consequences feel like. So help me fix it. Why would I? The question landed quiet, devastating, more honest than anything else she'd said all week. Give me one reason why I owe you anything else. You took 15 years of my work and burned it on a stage to make room for a woman half my age, and now you're standing in my office at 1 a.m. asking me to clean up the ashes. Cassian's jaw tightened, something raw and cornered showing through the exhaustion. Because if it all falls apart, people die. Not just me. Captains, soldiers, families who never asked for any of this. You think Lucian Graves and every other vulture circling this coast is going to wait politely while I figure out how to apologize? They're already moving. I can feel it. Something shifted in Alessandra's face at that. Not softness, not forgiveness, but a flicker of the strategist underneath the fury, the part of her that had spent a decade and a half thinking 3 moves ahead of men who thought they were thinking 1 move ahead of her. Who's already moving? She said slowly. Be specific. I don't know yet. That's what scares me. Cassian ran a hand through his hair, and for just a moment the arrogance fell away completely, leaving something younger and more frightened underneath it. Tomas thinks there are people inside my own organization positioning to take advantage of the chaos. He's been the only one still in my corner this week. Alessandra went very still. Tomas told you that, she repeated. Yes. Why? She didn't answer right away. She was thinking back, fast, through 15 years of small details she'd filed away without examining too closely. The way Tomas always seemed to know things slightly before he should, the quiet efficiency with which he'd handled the fallout of tonight's disaster, like a man executing a plan rather than reacting to a crisis, the strange, careful attention he'd always paid to Vivian whenever he thought no one important was watching. Alessandra. Why? Because in 15 years, she said quietly, Tomas has never once been the first person to tell me something was wrong. He's always been the last. And suddenly, he's the only voice you're listening to. The color drained slightly from Cassian's face. Before either of them could say anything else, Alessandra's phone began to ring on the desk behind her. Not her cell, but the secure line, the one reserved for exactly 4 people on the planet, all of them Dons. All of them people who didn't call after midnight unless something had already gone past the point of fixing. She crossed the room and answered it, and within seconds her whole posture changed, the blood leaving her face as she listened. When? She said. A pause. How many? Another pause, longer this time, her knuckles whitening around the phone. I'm coming. Don't move anyone until I get there. She hung up and turned to Cassian, and whatever fragile, furious intimacy had existed between them seconds earlier had been replaced entirely by something colder, sharper, more urgent. What happened? Cassian said. 2 of your warehouses on the eastern docks just went up in flames. Simultaneous. No warning. Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone holding panic at exact arm's length by sheer professional habit. And Salvatore Greco's people just intercepted a shipment that was never supposed to exist, moving Moretti product through a route only someone inside your organization could have authorized. Cassian's face went white. That's not possible. Nobody has authorization for that route except... He stopped. Except who? Alessandra said, already moving toward the door, already pulling her coat from the back of her chair with hands that, for the first time in 15 years, were no longer quite steady. Cassian's mouth had gone dry. The pieces were arranging themselves in his mind into a shape he didn't want to look at directly, a shape with a face he'd trusted since he was 19 years old, standing in a hallway with a phone pressed to his ear and a smile that, in hindsight, had never quite reached his eyes. Tomas, he said, the name coming out of him like something breaking loose. It's Tomas. It's been Tomas this whole time. The dock fires were still burning when Alessandra's car pulled up behind the police barricade, smoke rolling black against the pre-dawn sky, the air thick with the smell of burnt fuel and scorched wood. Cassian was right behind her, having insisted on driving himself despite the whiskey still in his blood, his knuckles white on the wheel the whole way there. Greco was already on scene, standing apart from the firefighters with two of his men, his coat collar turned up against the wind coming off the water. He didn't look surprised to see them. He looked like a man confirming something he already suspected. 800,000 in product, Greco said without preamble as Alessandra approached. Gone. And the route your people used to move it, the one that went through my territory without my sign-off, that's not a logistics error. That's a message. Whose message? Cassian demanded. Greco's eyes moved to him slowly, with the patient contempt of an old man who'd buried better men than Cassian Moretti and felt no particular urgency about this one. That's what I'd like to know, because whoever authorized that route knew exactly how to make it look like your signature was on it. It wasn't me. I didn't say it was you. Greco's gaze didn't waver. I said it was made to look like it was, which means somebody close enough to you to forge your authority is currently burning down what's left of your credibility, piece by piece, and you didn't even notice until your warehouses were already on fire. Alessandra's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A message from Marisol, 3 words long, and her stomach dropped reading it. Tomas is gone. She showed the screen to Cassian without a word. He read it twice, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic the second time, and they didn't. Gone where? He said, mostly to himself. Gone like a man who knew this was happening before it happened, Alessandra said. Gone like a man who's been planning his exit for longer than we've known to look for one. They found Vivian 40 minutes later in the nursery, sitting on the floor with her back against the crib and her phone clutched in both hands, her face streaked and swollen from crying. She looked up when Cassian came through the door, and something in her expression made his blood run cold before she'd even spoken. He's not answering, she said. Tomas, I've called 11 times. Why are you calling Tomas? Cassian said, and his voice had an edge to it that surprised even him. Because he's the only one who's been honest with me. Vivian's voice cracked. He told me there were people inside the family trying to use the baby, trying to use me. He said he was protecting us. Alessandra, standing in the doorway behind Cassian, felt something cold settle into her chest. What exactly did he tell you, Vivian? Word for word. I need you to think very carefully. He said Cassian was surrounded by people who wanted this exact thing to happen. The collapse. The families turning their backs. He said it wasn't really Cassian's fault, that he'd been pushed into it. Vivian's hands were shaking. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should trust the lawyer he introduced me to, some woman named Petra Voss. He said she had documents that would protect the baby's inheritance no matter what happened to the syndicate. The room went very quiet. When did you meet this lawyer? Alessandra said. 2 months ago. Tomas set it up. Vivian looked between them, finally registering the expressions on both their faces, the particular stillness of people staring at a trap that had already closed. What's wrong? 2 months ago, Cassian repeated, doing the math in his head, watching the timeline assemble itself into something monstrous. 2 months ago is before the summit, before any of this happened. He's been planning this since before I even stood on that stage, Cassian said, the realization landing in his voice like a physical blow. He turned to Alessandra. He didn't react to the chaos. He built it. Alessandra was already moving, pulling out her own phone, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. A forensic accountant who'd once helped her trace a Kovic family embezzlement scheme back to its source within 48 hours. I need everything you can find on a lawyer named Petra Voss, she said into the phone, already walking toward the door. And I need it before the sun comes up. It took 6 hours, 3 more departed staff members, and one increasingly frantic call from Dario Esposito's own daughter, who discovered her father's financial records didn't match what the family's books claimed, before the full shape of it became visible, and when it did, it nearly broke Cassian in half. They gathered in Alessandra's office, the same room where Cassian had stood 3 nights earlier, asking for help he hadn't deserved. Now the desk was covered in printouts, financial statements, a corkboard Marisol had hastily assembled with photographs and red string connecting names that should never have been connected. Petra Voss isn't a lawyer, the forensic accountant said over speakerphone, his voice tinny and exhausted. Or she is technically, but that's not her real function. She's an asset broker. She specializes in restructuring criminal organizations after a collapse, buying up fragmented territory cheap, consolidating it under new ownership before the original families can regroup. Whose payroll is she on? Alessandra said. That's the part you're not going to like. A pause, papers shuffling on the other end of the line. Her largest client over the past 18 months is a shell company registered in 3 different countries, untraceable on paper, but I cross-referenced wire transfer patterns with travel records and got a name that keeps surfacing. Lucien Graves. The name meant nothing to Cassian. It meant everything to Alessandra, whose face went rigid in a way Marisol had never seen, not once in 3 years of working beside her. You know him, Cassian said. I know of him. Alessandra's voice had gone careful, controlled in the specific way it got when she was forcing calm onto something that wanted to be panic. International broker, specializes in destabilizing criminal alliances and buying the wreckage. I crossed paths with rumors of him twice in 15 years, and both times the organizations he'd targeted collapsed within a year. Nobody's ever caught him directly. He doesn't get his hands dirty. He finds the cracks already forming and widens them until the whole structure falls on its own. And Tomas works for him. Tomas works for him, Alessandra confirmed, which means everything that's happened in the last 4 days, your affair, the summit, the warehouse fires, the shipment that burned your credibility with Greco, none of it was random. It was architecture. Tomas didn't react to your mistakes, Cassian. He built the conditions for you to make them, and then he made sure everyone watching saw exactly the version of events that would do the most damage. Cassian sat down heavily in a chair that wasn't his, in an office that no longer belonged to him in any sense that mattered, and put his head in his hands. He's been my head of security since I was 19. I trusted him with everything. That's exactly why he was useful to Graves, Alessandra said, not unkindly, though there wasn't much comfort left in her voice either. Nobody questions the man closest to you. That's the whole design. Vivian, who'd been sitting silently in the corner through most of this, finally spoke, her voice small and shaking. The lawyer, Petra. She has documents about the baby's inheritance. What does that mean? What does she want with my child? Nobody answered right away, because nobody wanted to be the one who said it out loud. It means, Alessandra said finally, gently, more gently than she'd spoken to Vivian in the entire 4 days since the summit, that your child was never meant to be a symbol of the future, Vivian. Your child was meant to be a legal foothold, a claim someone could use to dismantle whatever's left of this family once Cassian's done burning it down. If they can establish doubt about legitimate succession, if they can fracture the inheritance into a fight between factions, the entire territory becomes easier to carve up and sell. Vivian's hand flew to her stomach, her whole body curling protectively around the swell of it, her breath coming fast and shallow. No, he wouldn't. Tomas wouldn't use my baby like that. He was kind to me. He was kind to you because it worked, Alessandra said, and though the words were brutal, her voice had no cruelty in it, only the flat exhaustion of someone who'd seen this exact pattern before and hated being right about it again. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear right now, but everything Tomas told you was designed to make you trust him completely, and the timing of all of it, the lawyer, the warnings about people inside the family, every piece, was designed for this exact moment. For you to be frightened and alone and looking for someone safe to run to. Cassian's head snapped up. Where would she run to exactly? If she trusted him completely, where would Tomas tell her to go if things got bad enough? The question hung in the room like the smell of smoke that still clung to all their clothes from the docks. Vivian's face went white. He told me. If anything ever felt unsafe, if Cassian's family turned on me, there was a place. A property upstate registered to Petra's firm. He said it was protection, a safe house. When were you supposed to go there? He said. Vivian's voice broke entirely now, the full weight of what she'd been told finally crashing down on her at once. He said if I felt afraid tonight, after everything that happened, I should call him and he'd take me there himself. Alessandra and Cassian looked at each other, and for the first time in 4 days, the animosity between them dropped away completely, replaced by something far more urgent, a shared, wordless understanding that they were no longer dealing with a marriage falling apart or a business deal collapsing. They were dealing with a man who had spent 2 months engineering a pregnant woman's complete dependence on him, building toward a moment exactly like this one, and that moment had very possibly already arrived. "Call him," Alessandra said. "Right now. Tell him you're scared. Tell him you need to leave tonight." "What? No, I can't." "You can, and you will, because it's the only way we find out where he's taking you before he actually takes you there." Alessandra crouched in front of Vivian's chair, taking both her hands, her voice low and steady in a way that cut through the younger woman's panic like a hand finding purchase on a ledge. "I know you have no reason to trust me. I know what Cassian did to me, and I know you've spent 4 days being told I'm your enemy. But I am telling you the truth right now when I say that whatever is in that building upstate, it is not safety. It is the last piece of a trap that's been closing around you since before you ever knew my name." Vivian stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for the lie, and finding instead something that looked unbearably like the truth. She called him with trembling hands, Cassian and Alessandra standing just out of frame, Marisol recording the call on a second phone pressed to the speaker. "Tomas?" Vivian said, her voice cracking exactly the right amount, not even acting, the fear entirely real even if its source had shifted. "I'm scared. Cassian, everyone's saying things. There was a fire. I don't know what's happening. I don't feel safe here." "Vivi, listen to me." Tomas's voice came through warm, immediate, exactly the careful kindness he'd been cultivating for months. "You're right to be scared. It's worse than you know. I need you to leave the estate tonight. Do you understand? Pack light. Don't tell anyone where you're going, not even Cassian. Especially not Cassian. I'll have a car there in 20 minutes. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe. I promise you. I've been protecting you and that baby since the day you met me, and I'm not going to stop now." A pause, and something in his voice shifted, just slightly, just enough that anyone listening closely, anyone who'd spent 15 years learning to hear the gaps between what men said and what they meant, would have caught it. "This is the last step, Vivi. After tonight, nobody can use you against him anymore. You'll finally be safe." The call ended. Vivian sat frozen, staring at the phone, her face a mask of horror at what she'd just heard underneath the words. "Last step," she whispered. "He said this was the last step." Alessandra was already moving, pulling up a map on her laptop, marking the upstate address against known Graves-affiliated properties, from the file the forensic accountant had sent over. "If he's coming here in 20 minutes, we don't have time to call in the families. We don't have time to verify anything. We have one chance to follow that car and find out exactly what Graves has built before Tomas disappears, with the one piece of leverage that could destroy whatever's left of this family." "I'm coming," Cassian said. "You're the last person who should come anywhere near this," Alessandra snapped, the old fury flaring back up even now, even in crisis. "If Tomas sees you, the whole plan collapses. He thinks Vivian came to this decision because she's terrified and isolated. The second he sees your face, he knows something's wrong. Then what am I supposed to do? Sit here?" "You're supposed to do the thing you've never once done in this entire crisis," Alessandra said, rounding on him, years of restrained anger finally breaking the surface, which is trust someone else to handle something instead of charging in and making it worse. "I have spent 15 years cleaning up after your instincts, Cassian. Let me do my job." The words landed like a slap, and for a long moment Cassian just stared at her, jaw tight, every instinct in him screaming to fight that statement, to insist on control the way he always had. And then, for the first time since the summit 4 nights earlier, something in his face actually changed. Not surrender exactly, but recognition, the dawning, humiliating understanding that every catastrophic decision of the last week had come from exactly the impulse Alessandra was naming. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. What do you need from me?" Alessandra blinked, caught off guard by the capitulation, and something passed across her face too fast to name before she buried it back under professional focus. "Greco's men," she said. "You still have enough credibility with him to ask for backup, even if you don't have it with anyone else. Call him. Tell him what we know. Tell him we need eyes on that property within the hour, quietly, no movement until I give the signal. Cassian nodded and reached for his phone. Vivian, meanwhile, had begun gathering a small bag with shaking hands, following Marisol's whispered instructions, while Alessandra fitted a small tracking device into the lining of her coat, the same kind she'd used years ago, in a different life, in a negotiation that had nearly cost her everything. "You don't have to do this," Cassian said quietly, watching Vivian's hands tremble as she zipped the bag closed. "Yes, I do," Vivian said. And there was something different in her voice now, something that hadn't been there 4 days ago, when she'd stood on that stage glowing and terrified and entirely unaware of the role she'd been cast in. "He used me. He used my baby. I want to look him in the eye when he realizes I knew." A car pulled into the long drive outside the estate exactly 19 minutes later. Not Tomas's usual vehicle, something unmarked, windows tinted. A driver Vivian didn't recognize stepping out to open the back door for her with mechanical, practiced courtesy. She looked back once, toward the upstairs window where she knew Cassian and Alessandra were watching from the dark, and then got into the car. It pulled away into the night, tail lights shrinking down the long drive, and inside the house, Alessandra watched the small blinking dot on her laptop screen begin to move, her pulse hammering despite every year of training that had taught her to keep her hands steady, no matter what. "She's moving," she said, "heading northeast. That matches the upstate property." Cassian stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him, both of them staring at a screen that represented, in that moment, the single most dangerous gamble either of them had ever made. 40 minutes later, the dot stopped. Alessandra zoomed in on the map, cross-referencing the coordinates against the property records Marisol had pulled, and felt the blood drain from her face as the address resolved into something she recognized. Not the upstate safe house Tomas had described at all, but a private airstrip 30 miles in the opposite direction, one she'd flagged 18 months earlier in an entirely different investigation and then dismissed as irrelevant. "That's not the safe house," she said, her voice gone very quiet. "Cassian, that's not a safe house. That's an airfield." Cassian's face went bloodless. "He's not hiding her. He's moving her out of the country." Alessandra was already grabbing her coat, already dialing Greco's number with hands that, for the first time in 15 years, were shaking too hard to hit the right numbers on the first try. "If that plane takes off," she said, "we lose her. We lose the baby. And we lose the only proof we have that any of this was ever Graves's doing instead of yours." She finally got the call to connect, pressing the phone hard against her ear, already moving toward the door at a dead run. "Salvatore, I need everything you have, right now. We have maybe 20 minutes before—" The line cut out. Not hung up. Cut out. Dead air replacing Greco's voice mid-sentence. And when Alessandra tried to redial, the call wouldn't connect at all. "My phone's dead," she said, staring at the blank screen in disbelief. "Completely dead. It was at 60% 10 minutes ago." Cassian grabbed his own phone, already cursing before he'd even finished checking it. "Mine too. No signal, no bars, nothing." Marisol burst into the room, pale and breathless, her own phone clutched uselessly in her hand. "Something's jamming every signal in this building. I can't get a line out anywhere. Landline's dead too. Someone cut—" The lights went out. All of them at once, the entire estate plunging into sudden, total darkness. And somewhere outside, faint but unmistakable in the new silence, the sound of multiple car engines turning over in the long gravel drive. Vehicles that had not been there 60 seconds earlier. Vehicles that had clearly been waiting, parked dark and silent, for exactly this moment. The dark swallowed the room whole, and for one suspended second nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound, the faint electronic dying whine of the security system's backup battery failing somewhere in the walls. Then glass shattered at the far end of the hallway. "Down!" Cassian hissed, grabbing Alessandra's arm and pulling her below the window line as the first burst of gunfire chewed through the drywall where her head had been a half-second earlier, plaster dust raining down into her hair, into her open mouth as she gasped. Marisol screamed and dropped flat behind the desk, dragging the laptop down with her, the small blue dot on the screen, Vivian's coat, Vivian's tracker, Vivian's last 20 minutes before that plane took off, still blinking steady against the chaos exploding around them. "How many?" Alessandra said, her voice low, shaking, but already cycling into the cold clarity Cassian remembered from a decade ago, before titles and territory had buried the woman underneath them. Cassian, how many men did you see in the drive? 3 cars, maybe 9, 10 guns. He was already moving, crouched low, working his way toward the side hallway where a gun safe sat behind a false panel his father had installed before Cassian was even born. His hands found the panel in the dark by memory alone, fingers raw and clumsy with adrenaline, fumbling the combination twice before it clicked open. Graves doesn't send 9 men to scare somebody. He sends 9 men to finish something. Another burst of fire raked across the front of the house, closer now, and somewhere below them Cassian heard the front door give way under something heavier than a kick. A ram, maybe, or a boot reinforced with more weight behind it than any one man carried alone. "They're not here for the documents," Alessandra said, crawling toward him across broken glass, palms cut, not stopping. "If Tomas already has Vivian at that airfield, this isn't about leverage anymore. This is cleanup. We're loose ends." Cassian pressed a pistol into her hand. She took it without hesitation, checked the chamber with the brisk, practiced motion of someone who'd been raised in rooms where that skill mattered more than table manners. And Cassian felt something shift in his chest at the sight of it. 15 years married to a woman, and only now, with the house coming apart around them, did he understand how much of her he'd never actually seen. "You know how to use that," he said. It wasn't really a question. "My father didn't raise daughters who couldn't defend a negotiation when it stopped being words." She rose into a crouch, back against the wall, eyes scanning the dark hallway. "Where's the safe room?" "There isn't one. My father believes safe rooms were for men who'd already lost." "Your father," Alessandra said, "was an idiot about exactly the things that matter most. Noted. Improvised, then." Footsteps pounded up the main staircase, heavy, unhurried, the confident pace of men who believed the house already belonged to them. Cassian grabbed Marisol by the arm, hauling her up from behind the desk. "Service stairs," he said. "Back of the kitchen. It comes out near the garage." "What about you two?" "We're right behind you. Go." Marisol hesitated only a second before nodding, sprinting low and fast for the door, laptop clutched against her chest like the only thing in the world that mattered, which at that moment it very nearly was. Cassian and Alessandra moved the opposite direction, toward the stairwell where the footsteps were closing, and Cassian caught her wrist before she rounded the corner. "If this goes wrong," he started, "it's not going to go wrong." Her voice was flat, final, the voice of someone refusing to entertain an outcome because entertaining it meant admitting it was possible. "Stay behind me at the corner. I'll draw the first shot. You take the angle." "Alessandra." "We don't have time for whatever you're about to say." She pulled her wrist free, and for just a fraction of a second her eyes met his, something old and complicated and entirely unresolved passing between them in the dark. "Save it for after." The first man came around the corner with his rifle already raised, and Alessandra put 2 rounds in his chest before he'd finished registering she was there, the muzzle flash lighting the hallway in violent strobes, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, ringing in Cassian's ears as he surged past her and slammed his shoulder into the second man before he could bring his weapon to bear. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, Cassian's knuckles splitting open on the man's jaw, blood, his own, he realized distantly, from the broken window glass, mixing with sweat as he fought for control of the rifle wedged between them. The man was bigger, stronger, trained, and for 3 brutal seconds Cassian understood with total clarity that he was about to lose this fight, about to die in his own hallway in a house his grandfather had built, and the understanding didn't bring fear so much as a kind of furious animal refusal. He drove his thumb into the man's eye, felt him scream and buck, and used the half-second of distraction to wrench the rifle free and bring the stock down across his temple with everything he had left. The man went still. Cassian knelt over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from his split knuckles onto the unconscious man's shirt, and looked up to find Alessandra standing over him, gun still raised, scanning the dark hallway behind them for the next threat. "You good?" she said, not looking at him. "No," he said honestly, dragging himself up. "But I'm standing." "That'll have to be enough." They moved through the house like that for what felt like hours, and was actually closer to 4 minutes. Short, vicious exchanges in doorways and stairwells, the estate Cassian had grown up in transformed into something unrecognizable. Family portraits shattered by stray rounds. The dining room where he'd eaten 10,000 meals now reeking of cordite and smoke. Alessandra fought with a controlled, economical brutality that startled him every time. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The calm negotiator from 15 years of dinner parties, replaced by someone who'd clearly done this before, somewhere, sometime, in a part of her life she'd never once described to him. They lost track of how many men remained. Cassian took a graze along his ribs that he didn't fully register until later, the adrenaline burning too hot to let the pain through. His shirt soaked dark on one side by the time they reached the garage and found Marisol crouched behind Cassian's car, laptop still clutched to her chest, eyes wide and wet with terror. "There's a van," Marisol said, voice shaking. "Out front. I think it's how they got the others out. There were 2 more dragging someone toward it when I came down. Greco," Alessandra said suddenly, patting her coat pocket and coming up with the satellite phone she'd grabbed from the office in the chaos. Old technology, redundant, the kind of backup a woman who'd spent 15 years surviving exactly this sort of catastrophe never traveled without. The screen showed 2 bars. "It's working. The jammer must have a limited range." She dialed with bloody, shaking fingers, and when Greco's voice came through, gravel rough and immediate, something in Alessandra's shoulders dropped half an inch in pure relief. "Salvatore, I need everything. The estate is under attack. Graves' men, at least 9. We've taken some down, but there's more. And Vivian's been moved to a private airstrip 30 miles northeast. I'm sending you coordinates now." "On our way," Greco said. No hesitation, the gravel in his voice sharpening into something hard and fast. 8 minutes to the estate. The airfield's further out. I'll send Reyes's men. They're closer." "Salvatore," Alessandra's voice cracked, just slightly, just once. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet, girl. Stay alive long enough to mean it." The line went dead, and Alessandra turned to find Cassian watching her with an expression she didn't have time to interpret, because at that exact moment the garage door behind them buckled inward under a hard, controlled impact, and 3 more men poured through the gap with weapons already raised. "Down!" Cassian shouted, throwing himself in front of Marisol as automatic fire chewed through the car beside them, glass exploding outward, the world reduced to noise and light and the desperate scramble for any cover at all. Alessandra rolled behind a workbench, came up firing, took 1 man down with a shot to the shoulder that spun him into the second man's line of fire, bought half a second of chaos that Cassian used to drag Marisol bodily behind the engine block of a second car, his ribs screaming with every movement, blood now soaking visibly through his shirt. "Cassian!" Alessandra's voice, sharp with something that wasn't just tactical urgency anymore. "You're hit. I'm fine. Watch your left." The third man had circled wide, coming up on Alessandra's blind side, and Cassian watched it happen in the horrible slow motion that adrenaline carves out of real time. The man's weapon rising, Alessandra still turned toward the first threat, no time to call out, no time to do anything except move. He didn't think. He'd spent his entire adult life thinking, calculating, performing the careful arithmetic of power and consequence, and in this single moment all of it evaporated, leaving only the animal certainty that he would rather take whatever was coming than watch it land on her. He threw himself across the space between them. The shot caught him high in the shoulder, the impact spinning him sideways into a stack of stored crates, pain detonating through his entire upper body in a white-hot wave that drove the air from his lungs entirely. He hit the concrete hard, vision swimming, and somewhere above the ringing in his ears, he heard Alessandra scream his name, heard 3 more shots in rapid succession, heard a body hit the floor, then her hands were on him, pressing hard against the wound in his shoulder, her face inches from his. Blood, his blood, already soaking through her fingers. "Stay with me," she said, and her voice had broken open completely now, every wall she'd spent 15 years building stripped away by pure animal fear. "Cassian, look at me. Stay with me. Worth it," he managed, the words coming out in a wet, ragged breath, the edges of his vision going dark and bright by turns. "If it's you instead of me, worth it." "Don't you dare," she said, pressing harder, blood welling between her fingers despite the pressure. "Don't you dare do something noble now. After everything, you don't get to die being the man I always wanted you to be. You understand me. You stay." Marisol was beside them suddenly, ripping fabric from somewhere to press against the wound, her hands shaking but moving fast. Years of working for a woman who'd taught her, almost incidentally, how to function inside catastrophe instead of freezing within it. Outside, the sound of multiple vehicles tearing up the gravel drive at speed, headlights sweeping across the broken garage door. And for one terrible second, Cassian's blood-fogged mind couldn't tell if it was rescue or the rest of Graves's men arriving to finish the job. Then he heard Greco's voice, bellowing orders, the distinctive sound of Reyes's men fanning out across the property with the brutal efficiency of soldiers who'd done this before, and felt something in his chest loosen even as the world kept tilting sideways around him. "Move him carefully," Greco's voice, closer now, crouching into Cassian's narrowing field of vision, old face grim in the headlights. "Where's the girl, Vivian?" "Airfield," Alessandra said, not looking up from Cassian's wound, her hands still slick with his blood. "Reyes's men? Already moving. Should be there inside 10 minutes. 10 Greco's eyes moved between them, taking in the wreckage, the bodies, the blood, with the flat, unsurprised expression of a man who'd survived this exact kind of night more times than he cared to count. "We need to get him to a doctor who doesn't ask questions. I have 120 minutes from here." "He's not going to survive 20 minutes if that bleeding doesn't stop," Alessandra said, and there was real panic underneath the control now, breaking through despite everything she'd trained herself to suppress. "He's Moretti blood," Greco said, with something that might almost have been gentleness, if gentleness was a thing Salvatore Greco's face had ever quite learned how to make. "Stubborn enough to survive worse than this out of spite alone. Apply pressure." "We move now." They loaded Cassian into the back of one of Greco's armored vehicles, Alessandra climbing in beside him without being asked, her hands never leaving the wound, her voice a low, continuous murmur in his ear. Not prayer, not anything with a name, just the sound of her refusing, syllable by syllable, to let him slip under. "Stay with me," she said again, over and over, the words worn smooth with repetition. "We are not finishing this story with you dead in the back of Salvatore Greco's car. Do you hear me? You don't get to die before you fix what you broke." Cassian's eyes were heavy, the pain receding into something distant and strange, almost peaceful, which some buried instinct told him was the most dangerous sign of all. He forced them open, forced his cracked, bloodied mouth into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Bossy," he managed. "Even now." "Someone has to be," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, finally, completely. 15 years of careful composure dissolving into something raw and unguarded in the back of a speeding car. "I am not losing you to a man who isn't even brave enough to do his own killing." The vehicle screamed around a corner, throwing them both sideways, and somewhere ahead, far across the dark countryside, Marisol's laptop, propped open on the seat beside them, still tracking Vivian's coat, showed the small blue dot finally beginning to move again. Toward the runway markings of a private airstrip, toward an aircraft whose engines, according to Reyes's men closing in fast from 3 different directions, had just begun spinning up into a full screaming start. The airfield sat in a flat scrape of cleared land surrounded by black trees, a single runway lit by sodium lamps that threw everything into a sick orange glow, and Vivian stood at the bottom of the aircraft stairs with Tomas's hand wrapped tight around her upper arm, the engine screaming louder by the second, wind tearing at her hair, her bag already loaded somewhere inside the cabin above her. "We need to move," Tomas said, his voice pitched to carry over the engine noise, the careful warmth he'd cultivated for months finally starting to fray at the edges. "Now, Vivi, the window's closing." "What window?" Vivian said, and something in her voice had changed in the last hour, the fear still there but reshaped into something harder underneath it. "You keep saying that. What window? Where exactly are we going that needs a runway and an engine already running before I've even said yes?" Tomas's grip tightened just slightly, just enough that she felt it through the fabric of her coat. "Somewhere safe. I told you." "You told me a lot of things." She didn't move toward the stairs. You told me there were people inside Cassian's family who wanted to use my baby. You never said it was you. His face changed then, the warmth dropping away all at once like a mask finally too heavy to keep wearing, replaced by something flatter, colder, more honest in its cruelty than anything he'd shown her in 2 months of careful manipulation. Get on the plane, Vivian. No. This isn't a negotiation. His hand moved to the small of her back, not gentle anymore, pushing, and she dug her heels into the tarmac and twisted free with a strength that surprised them both. 6 months pregnant and shaking and refusing to be moved another inch. You used me, she said, the words tearing out of her raw and furious. You used my baby. You let me believe Cassian's own family was hunting us so I'd trust you, so I'd run straight into whatever this is. Your baby is the only reason you still matter to anyone, Tomas snapped, the mask gone entirely now. His face twisted into something Vivian had never seen and would never forget. Without that child, you're nothing. A pretty distraction Cassian was already getting bored of. Get on the plane or I drag you on it, and either way we're leaving in the next 90 seconds. Headlights swept across the tree line at the edge of the airfield, multiple sets closing fast, and Tomas's head snapped toward them with the first real fear Vivian had seen cross his face in 2 months of careful performance. Move, he shouted, abandoning all pretense of gentleness, hauling her bodily toward the stairs as she fought him with everything her exhausted, terrified body had left, screaming for help into wind that swallowed the sound whole. The first vehicle skidded to a stop 40 yards out, doors already opening before it had fully stopped moving, and Reyes's men poured out with weapons raised, shouting orders that the engine noise tore into fragments. Tomas dragged Vivian up the first 2 steps of the aircraft stairs, one arm locked around her, the other pulling a pistol from inside his jacket, and pressed the muzzle against her temple with a steadiness that made her entire body go rigid with terror. "Back off!" he shouted toward the approaching men, his voice cracking with something that wasn't quite courage. "Back off, or I finish this right now." The men slowed, weapons still raised but no longer advancing, the standoff freezing into something brittle and dangerous in the orange runway light, and Vivian stood absolutely still with cold metal against her skin and her child's heartbeat somewhere beneath her own racing pulse, and felt with sudden and total clarity that she was not going to let this be how her story ended. She drove her elbow back into Tomas's ribs with everything she had. It wasn't much force, not against a trained man, but it was enough. Enough surprise, enough of a half-second gap in his concentration for her to twist sideways and break his grip on her arm, throwing herself down the stairs and away from the gun as Thomas staggered backward with a grunt of pain and rage. The shot that followed went wide, cracking off into the dark beyond the runway lights, and then the night exploded into gunfire as Reyes's men closed the distance, and Vivian hit the tarmac hard on her side, curling instinctively around her stomach as the world became noise and chaos above her. It was over in under 30 seconds. Tomas got off 2 more shots before a round caught him in the leg and dropped him screaming onto the aircraft stairs, weapon clattering away across the metal steps, and 2 of Reyes's men had him pinned and disarmed before he'd even finished falling. Vivian lay on the cold tarmac, gasping, every part of her shaking, and felt hands, careful, urgent hands, turning her gently onto her back, a woman's voice asking her name, asking if she could feel the baby moving, and somewhere in the chaos of adrenaline and relief, she registered that she was, impossibly, still here, still breathing, still carrying a heartbeat that hadn't stopped despite everything. "He's not dead," one of Reyes's men called out, standing over Tomas's writhing, bleeding form. "Just bleeding pretty bad. Boss wants him alive." "Boss is going to get what he wants then," came Reyes's own voice, arriving at a half-jog from the second vehicle, his usual granite calm cracked open by something closer to fury as he took in the scene. His niece by marriage's child nearly orphaned before it was born, an aircraft full of evidence sitting on his own region's territory, a man he'd never fully trusted, finally unmasked as exactly the kind of poison Alessandra had spent 15 years trying to keep out of the Accord. He crouched over Tomas, who lay on the tarmac clutching his bleeding leg, sweat and tears mixing on his face. All the careful composure of 2 months of manipulation finally stripped away into something small and frightened. "Who's Lucien Graves?" Reyes said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. Where do I find him? Tomas said nothing, jaw clenched, and Reyes simply nodded to one of his men who pressed a boot down on the bleeding leg with enough pressure to make Tomas scream. I'll ask again, Reyes said. This time, Tomas talked. 40 minutes later, in a private medical suite Greco kept for exactly this kind of night, a doctor who'd long ago stopped asking questions worked on Cassian's shoulder while Alessandra stood pressed against the wall outside the room, her hands still stained with his blood, her whole body trembling with the particular exhaustion that follows the collapse of adrenaline. Not relief exactly, not yet, just the bone-deep aftermath of having held herself together for hours longer than any human body was meant to. The door opened. The doctor stepped out, pulling off bloody gloves, his expression unreadable in the way of men who'd delivered both good and bad news so many times. The two had started to look the same on his face. He'll live, the doctor said, and Alessandra's knees nearly buckled with the force of the breath she'd been holding for what felt like hours. Bullet missed the major vessels by less than an inch. He's lucky. He's also going to be in considerable pain for a long time, and he's not going anywhere tonight, but he'll live. Can I see him? Briefly, he's heavily sedated. She went in alone, the room dim and quiet after the chaos of the night, Cassian lying pale against white sheets with his shoulder heavily bandaged, an IV line taped into the back of one hand, his chest rising and falling in slow, drugged breaths. She pulled a chair to the edge of the bed and sat, finally, for the first time in what felt like days, letting her own exhaustion show on her face now that there was no one left to perform composure for. His eyes opened, slowly, unfocused at first, then finding her face in the dim light. Vivian, he said, his voice slurred and thick. The baby. Safe, Alessandra said. Both of them. Reyes's men got there in time. Something in his face loosened, the relief visible even through the sedation. Tomas. Alive, in custody, talking, according to Reyes. She reached out, almost without deciding to, and took his unbandaged hand in both of hers. He gave up everything. Graves's operation, the financial network, 3 other organizations Graves was actively destabilizing on the same playbook he used on us. It's enough to take him down completely, if we move fast enough. Cassian's eyes drifted closed again, then forced themselves back open, fighting the pull of the sedative. You saved my life, back there. You saved mine first. That's usually how it works, in case you hadn't noticed. Her voice cracked slightly on the attempt at lightness, the exhaustion making the mask harder to hold than usual. Don't do that again, by the way. Throwing yourself in front of bullets. I'd prefer if my ex-husband stayed alive long enough to clean up his own mess. Ex-husband, he repeated, and something in the word seemed to cost him, even sedated, even bleeding from a wound he'd taken for her. Is that still true? After tonight? That's a conversation for when you're not full of whatever they gave you for the pain. Alessandra. His hand turned in hers, weak but deliberate, fingers curling around her own. I was wrong about everything, about what mattered, about who actually held this family together, about you. I spent 15 years standing on something you built and telling myself I built it. His eyes were heavy, fighting to stay open, fighting to get the words out before the sedative pulled him under completely. I don't expect you to forgive that. I don't even know if I should be asking, but I needed you to hear me say it while I could still mean it clearly. She sat with that for a long moment, the hum of the medical equipment the only sound in the room, her thumb moving absently across his knuckles in a gesture so old and familiar it had survived even the worst 4 days of both their lives. I heard you, she said finally. Sleep. We'll talk about the rest when you're not bleeding through gauze. His eyes closed, and this time they stayed closed, his breathing evening out into real sleep, and Alessandra sat beside him for a long while in the dim quiet, holding the hand of a man who had broken something in her she wasn't sure could ever be fully repaired, even now, even after he'd taken a bullet meant for her chest. 3 weeks passed before the Black Crest Council reconvened, this time not in the glittering ballroom where it had all unraveled, but in a smaller, windowless conference room 2 floors below. No chandeliers, no champagne, No audience beyond the 11 family heads whose word still mattered on the eastern seaboard. Cassian arrived alone. His arm was still in a sling, the wound healing slower than the doctor had liked, but he'd refused to delay this meeting any longer, refused to let his own recovery become one more excuse hiding behind the wreckage he'd made. He stood at the head of the table where he'd once stood with a microphone and a pregnant mistress, and an arrogance that, in hindsight, made him almost unrecognizable to himself. "I'm not here to ask for the tri-state deal back," he said, his voice steady, despite the pain medication wearing thin in his system. "I'm not here to ask any of you to trust me again. I know what I cost this family, and I know what I cost every one of you who built something with my name attached to it in good faith." Greco watched him from across the table, arms folded, expression unreadable. "I'm formally relinquishing leadership of the Moretti Syndicate," Cassian continued, and the words came out steadier than he expected, like something he'd already made peace with in the 3 weeks since the airfield. "Effective today. I don't have the right to ask anyone in this room to follow a man who proved, in the worst possible way, that he didn't understand what leadership actually required." The room was silent. The particular silence of people recalculating something they'd already assumed they understood. "There's a structural problem with that," Reyes said slowly. "The Moretti territory doesn't run itself. Someone has to hold the seat, or the vacuum gets filled by exactly the kind of opportunist who almost destroyed all of us 3 weeks ago." "I know." Cassian's eyes moved down the table to where Alessandra sat, composed and steady in a dark gray suit, her expression carefully neutral in the way it always was when she was about to say something that mattered. "Which is why I'm proposing something the Accord has never had before. A neutral seat, not tied to any single family's bloodline or territory, but accountable to all of you equally. Someone whose entire history proves they hold agreements above ego, above power, above their own interest." He didn't say her name, he didn't have to. Every head in the room had already turned toward Alessandra Vale. "I'm proposing Alessandra as chief arbiter of the Continental Accord," Cassian said. "A permanent neutral authority over disputes between families, separate from territorial control, answerable to this council and no one else. She's spent 15 years doing this work without the title. I'm asking you to finally give her the authority that should have belonged to her years ago." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Greco slowly, deliberately began to clap. A single set of hands in the silent room, old and weathered, and one by one the rest of the council followed, until the sound filled the windowless room in a way that felt, to Alessandra, more genuine than any applause that had ever followed a Moretti name. She stood, finally, her composure cracking just slightly at the edges. 15 years of careful, unglamorous work, suddenly visible to everyone in a way it had never been allowed to be before. "I'll accept," she said, "on one condition. The Accord stops being something families honor because of fear of consequence, and starts being something they honor because the alternative, what almost happened 3 weeks ago, is a future none of us can survive twice. I want enforceable terms. Real consequences for violations, applied equally, regardless of name or history." "Even applied to him," Kovic said, nodding toward Cassian. "Especially applied to him," Alessandra said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat fairness that had made her trusted in rooms like this one for a decade and a half. "Nobody is exempt. That's the entire point." The council voted unanimously. By the end of the hour, the Black Crest Accord had a new structure, a new authority, and a new, fragile kind of peace built not on the threat of violence, but on the simple, radical idea that agreements should mean exactly what they said. 6 weeks later, Vivian gave birth to a daughter in a private hospital wing under a different name than the one she'd been using for the past 2 years, in a city far from any territory the Moretti Syndicate had ever claimed. Cassian visited once, brief and careful, holding his daughter for exactly 11 minutes, while Vivian watched him with an expression that held no anger anymore, just a tired, hard-won clarity about what they had been to each other and what they would never be again. "I'm not staying in this world," Vivian told him, taking the baby back gently when the 11 minutes were up. "Not the families, not the territory, not any of it. I want her to grow up somewhere none of this can reach her." "I'll make sure you're both provided for," Cassian said. "Whatever you need." I know you will. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the man who'd stood on a stage 4 months ago, certain of his own power in a way that had nearly gotten them all killed, and finding, instead, someone who looked older, quieter, stripped down to something more honest than he'd ever let himself be before. You're different now. I had to be. The alternative was dying as the man I used to be. He looked down at his daughter's face, memorizing it, knowing this might be one of the last times he saw it for a long while. Take care of her. Tell her, when she's old enough to ask, tell her the truth. All of it. I don't want her growing up on a version of this story where I come out looking better than I deserve. Vivian nodded, and for the first time since the night of the summit, something passed between them that wasn't quite forgiveness but was close enough to let them both finally exhale. Lucien Graves was found 4 months later in a villa outside a city that didn't extradite easily, brought in not by violence but by the patient, methodical work of 11 families finally cooperating instead of competing, financial records traced, shell companies unwound, the entire architecture of his operation exposed piece by investigators Alessandra had quietly assembled from across the Accord's combined resources. He stood trial in a private tribunal, the families convened themselves, the verdict swift and unanimous, and whatever happened to him after that, Alessandra made sure happened far from public knowledge, and far from anything that could be traced back to the Accord's new, carefully legitimate-looking face. Tomas served his usefulness in testimony and was never seen again by anyone connected to the Moretti family, his fate left deliberately, permanently unspoken. A year passed. The Continental Accord held, stronger and more codified than it had ever been under the old system of handshakes and unspoken understanding, and Alessandra Vale's name became, for the first time in 15 years, spoken with the kind of respect that didn't require a husband's title attached to it to be taken seriously. Cassian rebuilt what remained of his family's legitimate business interests slowly, without the syndicate's old territorial power behind him, working now as one face among 11 equal voices on the council rather than the entitled heir he'd once been. It was harder than the old life. It was also, he discovered somewhere in the slow grinding work of those months, the first time in his adult existence that anything he'd accomplished felt like it was actually his. On a clear evening in early autumn, the surviving Dons gathered once more at the Black Crest Casino, not in the grand ballroom this time, but on the open terrace overlooking the Atlantic, a smaller, quieter gathering with no cameras, no champagne towers, no performance of dominance for an audience that no longer existed. Alessandra stood at the railing, watching the sun bleed orange and gold across the water, when Cassian approached and stood beside her, close but careful, the easy intimacy of marriage long gone and not yet replaced by anything either of them had a name for. "They're calling it the Vale Accord now," he said. "Did you know that? Not the Moretti Accord. The Vale Accord." "I heard." "Does that feel like justice, after everything?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, turning it over before answering. "It feels like the truth, finally being allowed to have a name." She looked out at the water, at the families scattered across the terrace in small, easy clusters, men who 4 months ago had been one match strike away from continental war, now standing together without weapons, without fear, talking about nothing more dangerous than the autumn fishing season. "That's not nothing, Cassian. Most people never get to see the truth wear its actual name in their own lifetime." "I don't deserve to be standing here," he said quietly, "after what I did." "No," she agreed without cruelty, just simple fact. "You don't. But you showed up anyway, and you kept showing up, every difficult week since, doing the actual unglamorous work of earning back something you'll probably never fully get back. That has to count for something, even if it doesn't erase what came before it. Is there a version of this where we—" "No," she said, gently but completely, before he could finish the question. "There isn't. Not the way it was. Too much broke that night for it to ever be that again, and I think some part of both of us already knows that, even now." She turned to face him fully, something softer than 15 years of careful armor showing through, just for a moment, just for him. "But there's a version where we're both still standing here, doing work that matters, having survived the worst thing either of us ever lived through. I think that has to be enough. I think most nights it actually is." Cassian nodded slowly, accepting it the way he'd learned over 4 hard months to accept the things he couldn't change. Not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the quiet, earned humility of a man who'd finally understood the difference between the empire he'd thought he was owed and the one that had actually been built, brick by careful brick, by someone who never once asked for the credit. Below them, the Atlantic kept moving the way it always had, indifferent to crowns and titles and the small, desperate wars men fought over both. And on the terrace above it, 11 families who had nearly destroyed each other stood together in the fading light, bound now not by fear or blood, but by the harder, rarer thing Alessandra Vale had spent her whole life building without ever once asking to be thanked for it. The woman once discarded on a stage had become the architect of everything that came after. And as the last light disappeared over the water, the Black Crest Terrace settled into something the casino's marble halls had never once held in all its violent history. Not power, not dominance, not fear. Just quiet. Earned, fragile, and finally, entirely real.